Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn, I will usually suggest armor and trinkets that allow for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold under the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class is the Elementalist and the elite specialization is the Catalyst. And we're going to talk about the power DPS build, an open world roamer and a quickness variant. The build links are as always in the description. Now before we go into the details of the build, let's talk some pros and cons. The build has quite nice damage with 35k on the golem with a simplified rotation compared to the benchmark. It also provides good utility through protection, lots of might and quickness. It's probably one of the most versatile builds in the game because it offers everything you might need on demand. However, on Catalyst there's a lot to learn. There's a large number of skills to use, buffs, track and combos to learn as well. The build is also quite squishy in open world, but there are ways to resolve that problem. Finally, the hammer projectiles can be annoying in some fights if there is projectile hate. Alright, before we go into the details on the skills that we're gonna use, let's go over the general playstyle on Catalyst. Catalyst is, at least at first glance, designed with a high level of complexity. Breaking it down to the essential pieces thus wasn't easy and took me quite some time to simplify the power rotation to a degree that I'm satisfied with, while doing enough damage to not be subpar to other options. Like all Elementalists, Catalyst has access to 4 attunements but cannot weapon swap in combat. We got fire, water, air and earth. I could do the usual avatar reference here, but nah. Catalyst doesn't fundamentally change how attunements work compared to core Elementalist, but it is designed to be used with a hammer as the weapon of choice, which in turn incentivizes you to rotate through the elements with the 4 different Hammer 3 skills and passive buffs you can only maximize by doing that, for example Elemental Empowerment and Empowering Auras. That said, you will not get around swapping attunements in your gameplay without severely hindering your effectiveness in both open world and group content. That is because Catalyst evolves around combo fields and using them inside different elements to gain auras and applying CC. Auras and CC will then supply you with stacks of different damage buffs. With Hammer, it has access to 4 combo fields, fire, water, lightning and poison through the respective sphere for each attunement, which you can find on the top right of your weapon skills. These spheres cost energy, a unique resource that accumulates over time when you hit enemies, but only while you do not have a sphere active. This means that you can't just mindlessly spam all 4 spheres on cooldown because you won't be able to rebuild energy. They are circular AoEs that you can place on the ground and they last for 5 seconds. They deal damage and provide boons every second inside of their radius. Fire provides might, water resolution, air provides quickness and earth protection. In this build we'll only be using 3 elements, because that is enough to maintain the essential buffs for damage purposes, fire, air and earth. If you want to go for the benchmark you'll have to go into water as well, but for the simplified build here the others are sufficient. Note that water 4 and 5 are combo finishers, so if you need additional combo field options like an additional heal, Condi Cleanse or CC, it's worth taking a look at them too. So let's go through the skills in fire, air and earth. The respective auto attacks are pretty basic, they all deal some damage and fire also applies burning. The Hammer 2 skills are the main contributors to your damage, especially Hurricane of Pain in air. These are always the first skills you want to cast in the 3 elements for that reason. Hammer 3s are all projectiles circulating around you, damaging enemies and applying conditions for 15 seconds. On the power build and group content the conditions aren't that big of a deal, but if you use Celestial in open world for example, they become essential, especially the burning from fire and the bleeding from earth. While the projectiles are up, they will also supply you with passive buffs. Fire increases all damage dealt by 10%, air the crit chance by 10%, earth reduces strike damage taken by 15%, and water Condi damage taken by 15%. In consequence, fire and air are the main priorities for damage. Activating another Hammer 3 in a different elements will extend all other buffs by 15 seconds, so you can easily maintain them as long as you use at least 3 of them. Hammer 3 always has 2 cast options. First, you will activate the respective rotating projectiles, and then you can use Grand Finale to launch all projectiles at the enemy. This will, however, also cause you to lose the buffs. You need to use Grand Finale though, because otherwise the buffs will run out anyway. You need to be careful not to double cast Hammer 3 since you will launch the projectiles by accident if you do. As the first cast of Hammer 3, the projectiles do not have a cast time. The best strategy is usually to always use Hammer 2 and then immediately cast Hammer 3 during the cast of Hammer 2. You generally want to maintain the damage buffs as much as possible, especially the fire one. In order to do that, you can always use Grand Finale and Fire and then cast Hammer 3 1 second later to maximize the uptime. More on that in the rotation section though. The Hammer 4 skills have different effects. Fire 4 does good damage, so you want to use it whenever it is available. Air 4 launches yourself backwards by 28,974 meters, at least it feels that way, and is the most annoying misclick you can have. Don't use this in group content, it might yeet you into oblivion. In open world though, it's a nice CC skill that can put you out of danger as well. Earth 4 is a neat block that also applies an aura. If you know there's a large damage hit coming in and you're in Earth, you can use this. I already mentioned that the spheres are all combo fields, but we also need to make use of them to actually gain damage buffs. We can do that through the Hammer 5 skills because they are all blast finishers and do good damage. Fire 5 provides boons, Air 5 is a stun, and Earth 5 immobilizes and applies bleeding. All of them should be used only when you have a sphere up. Keep in mind that Power Catalyst can actually be played very well from range if you alternate between fire and air only, since most of the attacks have a 600 range. So in essence, you are a bit more flexible in terms of positioning most of the time. This helps a lot in open world once you get used to it, since you can kite a lot of stuff and avoid damage that way. At this point, I also want to mention that using Celestial gear and playing it as a condition focused build is way more effective than any other option in open world. I might make a separate shorter guide for that though, since it does change how the spec is played. I still put a link to the build in the description though. Moving on to utilities. As the default healing skill in open world, I use the Glyph of Elemental Harmony. This will provide different boons based on your attunement and a strong heal with a short cooldown, which is very nice. In group content you can slap on Arcane Brilliance instead. I'll go through the advantages of this in a second. Then I always use Glyph of Storms. It's a great AoE skill. In general open world roaming I prefer Firestorm for the shorter cooldown, while Lightning Storm provides more sustained DPS in group content. After that we got Relentless Fire. The skill grants you the 10% increased damage for 5 seconds and should always be used inside your fire sphere, because that will increase the duration by another 3 seconds. The sphere and this skill line up nicely in the rotation though, so that you can always get it inside the sphere if you use them right after each other. In open world I usually don't use this though, because it doesn't have any utility aside from damage. You're better off running the Glyph of Lesser Elementals most of the time. The next skill is a designated flex spot. By default you should use Arcane Blast to have a combo finisher on demand that is used every second rotation instead of Earth 5. It's a ranged combo finisher as well, so it can be used nicely to replace Fire 5 in cases where you want to stay at range 2. If you want to use something else here for group content, you can replace your healing skill with Arcane Brilliance, because that is also a blast finisher. That allows you to put on additional utility that enable you to apply tons of CC like the Lightning Conjure or Arcane Shield for a block on demand. And this costs only a small fraction of DPS, so it's definitely useful. For the elite, I always run the Elemental Glyph with the Earth Elemental. The reason is that the Earth Elemental provides 2 permanent stacks of elemental empowerment through its active skill Stomp, so it makes reaching the cap of 10 stacks much easier. It's also a very good punchback in open world versus harder bosses. The only downside is that it gets removed upon mounting or switching zones. In terms of gear, Power Catalyst is fairly easy to set up. It uses full Berserker with Scholar Runes. You'll reach the crit cap with this setup even if you don't have Spotter and Banners, because the lightning projectiles supply another 10% crit chance. The Quickness build is also the default open world gear setup and uses 3 Diviner pieces, the chest, the amulet and the hammer. That way you obtain a lot of boon duration with minimal effort. The benchmark build on Quicklist has many more small pieces of Diviners on it to optimize to the final fraction of a percent, but that's not really efficient in any way. The sigils on the weapons are force and impact on the power DPS build and accuracy and concentration on the Quicklist/open world build. In terms of consumables, you can always run power and ferocity food and the potent superior sharpening stone, or any other level 80 equivalent sharpening stone. If you need additional survivability, you can also use toughness and incoming damage reduction food. Now that we covered the gear, we can talk about traits and specializations. The traits of choice are very similar on all 3 build variants, but there are a few differences between Quickness open world and the DPS build. I won't go through all traits in detail, but only talk about the ones that have an impact on the playstyle of the build. Let's start with Air. Air is a nice specialization for power damage because it grants Kazai Permanent Fury, a lot of ferocity, 20% damage against targets with less than 50% health, higher movement speed and reduced recharge on air skills. These traits are set in stone for group content. Now if you paid attention, you noticed that we're using a lot of glyphs in open world. This synergizes nicely with the inscription trait that reduces the recharge on glyphs and also makes them grant boons. This way you'll have a much better uptime on essential boons like Might and Protection. You can also use Zephyr's boon to provide yourself with Fury in that case, since you lose the access to it as a trade-off. Now, Bolt to the Heart, the Grandmaster trait, is the reason why you see a DPS decline for a bit after the initial burst, but then increase again significantly after your target has reached 50% health. Next up we have Fire. Fire is another great specialization for damage since it grants burning on critical hits, fire aura when attuning to fire, 450 power and increased strike damage against burning enemies when fire fields hit a foe. You can't make full use of the Grandmaster trait since we don't have a lot of fire fields, but it's still worth it. In open world you can use Blinding Ashes for a bit of soft CC, but it's usually not needed. Finally, we're using Catalyst, of course. Catalyst includes 3 essential traits that shape the playstyle: Elemental Empowerment, Empowering Auras, and Elemental Epitome. Elemental Empowerment increases all your stats by 1% per stack and has a maximum of 10 stacks that last 15 seconds each. You gain 3 stacks automatically while in combat, so you need 7 additional stacks to reach the cap. Reaching the cap is particularly important on the DPS build because it will double the effectiveness of the buff to 2% per stack while you have 10. That compounds to an insane damage increase since the damage stats also interact, and this applies after all other multipliers. It's also why Celestial is very powerful in Catalyst since that will make all the stats you have even more powerful. How can you accumulate stacks? First, you can gather them by applying Immobilize or Disables to the enemies through Vicious Empowerment. Your sources of CC or Immobilize are Air 5, Earth 5 and the Earth Elemental active skill Stomp. Each of those will apply 2 stacks each. Aside from those, you can also gather stacks by gaining auras. You gain auras by doing a combo field on Catalyst through Elemental Epitome, but only once every 10 seconds per attunement. That's partially why we're using several elements instead of just camping 1 or 2. You also gain a fire aura whenever you attune to fire, so that's nice to have on top because it provides another stack. The rotation is designed to find the easiest way to always make sure that you permanently have 10 stacks. Furthermore, you want to gain an aura every 10 seconds so that you stack up Empowering Auras, which grants 10% damage. In the Quickness/Open World build, we'll swap from Empowered Empowerment to Sphere Specialist because that doubles your duration of the Quickness, Might and Protection gained from your spheres. And that brings me to how to provide Quickness. With the gear changes we're making, you don't really need to change much about the rotation. The Air Sphere is the only source of Quickness you have. It provides 6 pulses of Quickness and we'll use it every 16-ish seconds, so we only need like 3 seconds of Quickness per pulse to provide it with some wiggle room. The 45% boon duration that we have is enough to provide Quickness, but if you want more flexibility, you can do 3 things. Number 1, change food or the utility item to concentration. Number 2, use more pieces of Diviner gear. Or number 3, use Arcane instead of Fire. That also makes you apply more boons to allies when changing attunements while not losing a large amount of DPS. This is a nice way to apply a good amount of protection, might and swiftness on top. Just play with the boon duration a little bit to get an idea of where the sweet spot is for you. It can be a little tricky sometimes, since you'll need to position the sphere where your allies will be for around 5 seconds since it's stationary. Maybe they change the spheres to follow you around one day. Hope dies last, I guess. Finally, let's go through the simplified rotation. The rotation is pretty intuitive and loops nicely. It is more relaxed compared to the benchmark, but still engaging enough to keep you busy. The rotation is designed to provide the most simple way to maintain 10 stacks of Elemental Empowerment and 5 stacks of Empowering Auras all the time. We'll also maximize the uptime on the fire and air projectile buffs. For the opener, we'll precast the Earth Elemental and swap to fire. There we'll use all skills once, including the Earth Elemental active Stomp. Stomp should be used on cooldown at all times. While doing that, make sure to use the Sphere before Fire 5 and Relentless Fire, so you get both the combo in Fire and the benefit to the duration of Relentless Fire. Also beware of double casting Hammer 3 here, you can do it during the cast of Fire 2 or 4 to avoid that. Then swap to Air. We're gonna be using 2 first, then 3 while 2 is casting, and then Lightning Storm when it is available. Then cast the Air Sphere and use Air 5 to combo for 3 stacks of Elemental Empowerment through an Aura and a stun on it. Then immediately swap to Earth, use Earth 2 and the Hammer projectiles while 2 is casting. Then use either Earth 5 or Arcane Blast/Brilliance for a combo to gain another stack of Elemental Empowerment and maintain Empowering Auras. Arcane Blast should only be used here whenever Earth 5 isn't available. Stay in Earth until Fire becomes available again and immediately swap to it. Upon the swap, you'll gain a Fire Aura, then use Fire 2 and 4. In Fire you have 2 combos, Grand Finale and Fire 5. These and Relentless Fire should all land inside the Sphere window, so depending on that you might have to delay your Fire Sphere. The cooldowns of Fire 5 and Relentless Fire match, so they can always be used in succession. After using Grand Finale, reactivate Fire 3. You don't have the risk of double casting here because Grand Finale will still be on cooldown. Stay in Fire 2 until you've used Fire 2 a second time and then repeat the rotation from Air. If you want to start getting the basics down, just practice doing Hammer 2, 3, the Sphere and 5 first and stay in Fire until the second cast of Fire 2 is available. Then gradually put more pieces into the rotation whenever you're comfortable enough until you reach around 34 to 35k DPS consistently. As I said before, the quickness rotation looks pretty much the same, but you want to swap from fire to earth more quickly in the opener by skipping all but hammer 2 and 3. You'll also want to cast the air sphere as soon as you enter air, so you provide quickness as soon as possible into the fight. With this rotation, Power Catalyst becomes a very enjoyable and effective spec to play in all aspects of PvE without having to treat your keyboard as a piano. Alright, that is it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Catalyst. See you next time and happy combo fielding.